small or medium-sized company, multiple players on that team will have a better chance of getting things out to market or continuing on with the research that was started through our funding. The equity and justice lens needs to be applied on how we consider these. I will say this is a theme at the executive board as well. And then I think we all know this is not, it's not easy. There's not plug and play on how you do that. I think one recommendation you'll hear is that if we're going to do it, we're going to need funding and time to do it and do it right. And I heard that within this group as well. So we want to align it with our policy goals, and with that we'll probably, not only our policy goals, but just in the situation we find ourselves with COVID and whatnot, there's definitely going to be a desire to probably focus on things that have job potential, can possibly create some economic development, and that probably leads to more the demonstration end of the RD&D spectrum. However, the next slide, I think it's clear within this group that this is the innovation fund, and we can't keep our, we can't forget that innovation is hard, it's risky. We need to be comfortable with that risk, and we have to focus on that true innovation. So that means, although it may be coming towards the demonstration side, don't completely just choose things that are ready to shovel ready, that can go in the ground. Make sure we realize a lot of this innovation still happens in the labs, and lab scale demonstrations and things like that should still be a focus area. We can't wait. Innovation takes a long time, and all the studies show that innovation is required to meet our long-term goals, and that's going to take a while for that innovation to develop. So focused innovation, but focused innovation on our goals, but realizing that those things take a long time and nothing is for sure when you're talking about innovation. It's got to be focused on Washington's problems. That being said, we're as a state extremely good at innovation, and we could potentially be helping develop things that really have an impact globally, and we need to keep our eyes on those, because those are going to have the most impact, even if it's not as clear the immediate impacts for Washington's particular problems or needs to reach our goals. And then that focus on the fact that there just aren't a lot of matching funds out there anymore. The feds have, so much of the research dollars come from the feds. We need sources of external match in order to draw these larger pots of money into the state. So that's a quick overview of what we talked about last week or last meeting. And anybody have any comments or questions, or did I completely botch something or miss a big point that you guys feel is important? All right, hearing nothing. Try to get my screen here. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. So with that, we've got 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours now. We'll try to jump right into it. I'll go to the next slide. So this one, trying to focus on a little bit more of, besides the large scale addressing and focusing on those policies we already have, wanted to try to get a little bit more into the weeds on how you actually run a program that promotes innovation. And I would even get down into the way we put out RFPs, the kind of information we ask in those RFPs or those funding opportunities, whatever you want to call them, how we judge those, the kind of structures we put in place to run a program like this that is most effective. I know a lot of you on the call probably work through different federal organizations, other institutions and whatnot that put out money for these kind of things that promote innovation, and the way they do it, the processes they use to do it is very interesting. And with that, we don't have to talk about them now, or we can hit on them, but if you have some real areas or real programs that you think are really good, please share those with me, and we can get interns and other folks internally looking at those and better understanding those. There is always the problem that the federal government, each state has its own rules, its own ways of doing things. Our state is unique often and might make it difficult to do some of those things, but part of this is to highlight, and I think we tried to say it to the committee yesterday, this is a good way to get kind of markers on the board. Everything doesn't have to be doable. It may not be doable in this next round of the Clean Energy Fund, but there's a belief, regardless of the governor who we have, if they like the Clean Energy Fund or something, there is going to be continued funding for the next 30 years to do things like this. And we should be thinking not only about the specifics of how we've traditionally thought about the Clean Energy Fund, but the fact that we are going to most likely be giving money to promote innovation and promote clean energy and clean technologies for many years to come. And so as we look at designing those programs over time, get some ideas on the board of what makes those most effective. So as usual, the Clean Energy Fund very likely will look fairly similar in this next legislative session. And there still is not much word internally on what exactly that's going to look like, or what exactly the governor's team is thinking that would look like. Like I've mentioned, I think it will probably, with everything else going on, look fairly similar to what we've had. But part of this exercise is often to think outside the box and maybe challenge or bring new ideas to the table on what it could look like. So keep yourself in the box and also think outside the box. And with that, I'll jump right into the questions we have for today. Got about maybe a half hour per question. So we'll try to keep on track. And I've got a few other thoughts that I wanted to bring up as well. But let's start with that first bullet. And I feel like this bullet in particular, we probably talked about a lot yesterday. So I don't know if we need to talk about it as much, but we will start with it. I keep saying yesterday, the last meeting of this group. So what are the technological questions we want to answer? And are there use cases we should be focusing on? So I think we got into it a bit. What are our strengths? What are our, focus on our strengths as a state that we already have inherent? But can we drill down besides aerospace, clean buildings, energy efficiency? Are there true questions that are immediate that we know we have to address, that we could focus funding opportunities on to really address those questions that we know we need to hit for these policies or to meet our state goals? I'll just open it up. Does anybody have any thoughts immediately? I mean, I think about, obviously, the built environment. What are some major gaps that we could focus some funding on? I know, Angela last meeting talked about how important AI is going to be on building operations to drive down efficiency. Are there things like that we should be very specific in looking for? And it doesn't have to be the whole pot of money. We can always break this pot of money up into different focus areas or whatnot. But does anybody have any ideas on true technological challenges right now that we need to focus on?
So
yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I was just going to say in the built environment, I think it's probably storage is one of the biggest issues, and we can think of that broadly. I don't think it necessarily has to be batteries. It could be hydrogen. It could be thermal storage. It could be anything like that. And I say that because we're lucky to have such a fantastic source of cheap hydro available day and night, but in the built environment, we need buildings to be able to integrate with the grid in a smarter way. So there's energy management, but actually probably having localized storage so that you can take advantage of renewables when they're available. And so there's an energy management aspect to that, like you said, AI, but then there's just a variety of different energy storage technologies. And I think that's where we're lagging. Solar and wind are becoming, are very cheap and ubiquitous. They're off to the races, I feel like, and it's the storage side and integrating storage into an energy management system that becomes a big challenge. So that'd be my focus on the built environment.
So, sorry, go ahead. You guys keep talking. Don't let me talk.
So I'd echo Aaron's and maybe take a slightly different take on the built environment. I think it's more definition than anything else, and that is encouraging research, development, and demonstration in the area of zero energy buildings, self-contained buildings, zero carbon buildings. I mean, you can kind of use the terminology that you would like in that space, but I think that's one way to kind of frame the challenge.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And if you would encourage people to say, what R&D and D stuff can you bring forward that helps advance Washington's specific agenda in there, as well as appeals to markets beyond the borders of Washington.
And an interesting, as you're talking about defining that and marketing it to a wide variety of folks, I would say self-sufficiency maybe is an interesting way to talk about it, or energy independence, building level energy independence, some of those kinds of things. There's a lot of folks that would, where this just, hey, I got the storage, I got solar and wind or whatever, and I'm going to park my building wherever I want it and be just fine. And then there's urban areas where those same things matter, right? So I think you can think about it that way, maybe.
So in terms of existing demand, have you talked about natural gas at all? Is that a big piece of the Western Washington energy use?
Yeah, I mean, it would be, from state's point of view, the conversation has to be on eliminating or replacing natural gas. Most of the signals from the governor's office and stuff is there's not a lot of interest in spending money to make natural gas systems more efficient or to use natural gas better. It's really a focus on either eliminating it or replacing it with a renewable natural gas.
Right. And those are both big challenges, and for older buildings can be kind of expensive depending upon what your conditions are.
So I've had some interesting conversations with power utilities and technology solutions folks, identifying the natural gas infrastructure as a really phenomenal asset towards solving the problems that we're talking about solving, as long as if you can figure out a way to replace existing fossil fuel gas supplies with zero carbon natural gas, so power to gas type systems, then that will allow essentially the natural gas infrastructure can act as energy storage assets and distribution assets, and even long-term storage, seasonal storage almost, if you can deploy the power to gas concepts. And that probably ends up, I don't know if there's a good chance that saves you a ton of infrastructure investment if you can solve those challenges. They're difficult challenges to solve, no doubt about it.
And Brian, your comment on the governor's office and the state not being interested necessarily in making incremental improvements in natural gas leads me to think about and suggest that you might want to lay out some kind of criteria that what you're looking for in general are transformational kinds of innovation rather than simply incremental innovation. And you could even, use some illustrations in there. in general would not be interested in funding an incremental improvement in the efficiency of, gas using equipment, as opposed to the kinds of things that Aaron, was talking about, where you might want to talk about ways to use the existing gas infrastructure for, hydrogen deployment, or use the existing infrastructure for some ability to more effectively bring in renewable natural gas, or substituting, those kinds of things. That might be a way to push this, because I think that also aligns with some of the discussions that have gone on with the state energy strategy, that the intent of that is to come up with not simply incremental improvements, but transformational policy or recommendations in there, and this could align with that.
Yeah, I agree with that comment, that to use these precious dollars for bigger change. And I would suggest considering, looking at how our landscape is structured, maybe considering where this is bigger, more transformational, but where people are living, how people are getting to where they work with our now pandemic world, how are people working in the first place? Like, there's a ton of innovation that's needed in the energy space and in the that reverberates in terms of how people are living now, to gain a lot more energy efficiencies and do bigger investments so that people can be consuming less energy. I think another part of that is, and I think they're ready, but echoing it, localizing energy development a bit more. I know Puget Sound Sage has done some studies in their area of jurisdiction in South King County around the importance of localized energy, community-based energy sources, and kind of energy ownership, which leads to more efficient energy and cleaner energy in general. So to me, through the lens of transformation, we should really be kind of centering what the communities are looking for in a more efficient way. Which I know is different than how these funds have been managed, just to say that, but it was like a great opportunity.
Rebecca, could you point to some specific innovation examples that to help me understand what kinds of things we'd be looking for in that arena?
I can't point to like technology, because I don't think it's necessarily about technology. I think it's, although technology comes into play, of course, but looking at, I'm thinking as simply as like broadband investment to help people work in this current context better, be more efficient. I'm thinking about when we're investing in housing stock, how is that being created in a way, and where is it being located so that people are closer to the resources that they need and it's done more efficiently and to use less energy. I'm thinking about how these funds, these programs can improve or invest in our transportation network. I think there's a long list of things to consider within the bucket of transformation, how our energy is being used and generated in general, and make it so that it serves more people, and kind of to meet the intent of the 100% clean law, for example, really investing in where that energy is being generated in a more efficient and clean way. I could keep going if this is helpful, but that's what I'm thinking. I don't have specific projects.
No, that's yeah, I support all of that, and I think that makes sense. I guess I partly, it's very holistic, right? It's you're wanting to take a very broad look at how we use energy and how society leans on it and how we consume it. I wonder if there are, and because of that, it makes me feel like the Clean Energy Fund is this tiny little thing. Do we need to figure out a way to engage a broader set of state initiatives in order to tackle what you're talking about, rather than try to steer the Clean Energy Fund towards tackling that? You know, it's almost like the Clean Energy Fund is too small to do that. We need, and so I don't know. I'm not the state policy expert by any stretch, but I wonder if that is just something, if there's a way to get those kinds of things more broadly integrated across a whole bunch of different state initiatives.
I think there definitely is, and I guess my thought is, which of those, of that holistic transformation, how can these set of funds, this fund, advance that? It should be done in concert with these other pathways of dollars. And it should accomplish, you know, it should not, initial sideboards are, don't go invest in things that are already required, for example. You know, be additive to, and seek the intent of what's required. So the 100% clean law requires utilities to do a lot of things, shift the dollars away from the utility requirements and more to perhaps the communities that have to engage so that the utilities can be successful in their efficiency programs or low-income assistance programs, for example. That's like a channel of this holistic shift that needs to happen, where these funds could support that, and that should be done alongside the other programs.
I think that's a good framework, and I think the real challenge we have is that, like, we've got a lot of larger holistic either policies in place or ideas of policies that could be put in place with that holistic view. And how do we, like Rebecca said, make sure that we're looking for or incentivizing applications from projects that will fill those gaps? And I think instead of just helping folks get to where they're already obligated to be, there are still a lot of gaps that we know, and make sure we focus the funds on those gaps. I think then the challenge gets to be, when you have such a huge problem and such a relatively small amount of money, is how do you figure out how to do that? And that's where we're looking for your ideas. But I do think that is a good theme to think about this, and is filling those gaps that aren't already obvious and required. Scott, you were going to say something earlier, did we? Oh, no, you got it. Oh, that's right. I got you. Sorry, I'm trying to take notes at the same time. So,
Brian, are those gaps that you were just referring to, is that all well documented somewhere? Is there something you can point people to that says, hey, here's the problems that we have identified between us and reaching our 2040, 2045 goals?
Good question. And I think Tony's been most involved in it. I think a lot of the state energy strategy, I think, is looking to highlight a lot of those gaps. I know some of the work that was done previously around pathways and whatnot, a lot of that work was done before our policies talked about some of those gaps. But a lot of this, and a timing issue, obviously state energy strategy is going to take a little bit longer, but Tony, is that
I think that would be the place that I would look. That's certainly the intent. If you follow what they've been talking about and the work that's been done by the consultants, is really to identify what those pathways look like, and what in particular are the gaps and needs in that space. And just to follow through a little bit on the, not to derail this discussion of the wider talk, but I'm also thinking in terms of technology. I think it might be a worthwhile exercise for one or both of the interns to take a look at some of the technological roadmap work that is out there. And I'm thinking in particular things like the work that Terry Oliver's group used to do at the Montville Power Administration in terms of roadmap for a variety of different technologies, the work that the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance does for their market transformation. DOE over the years, although probably more oriented towards basic research, have done some pretty good technological assessments and needs in that space, and maybe bringing some of that into this environment as you're putting things together. Again, an example might be, if you really emphasize the built environment, looking at what work has been done in that space, identifying what some of the big needs are that people have identified in terms of technologies or solutions that are needed, and then thinking about how those map into companies, resources, capabilities within Washington.
I think that's a great idea. One of the other, just to highlight another source of that those kinds of resources, I think the Breakthrough Energy Coalition did a really good job of summarizing, all the way from agriculture to grid energy, hydrogen, all of that, all battery research, everything is kind of, they put together a one-pager even. So it's all broken down into, it's a dense one-pager, but it's 100 different bullet points that say, hey, here are all the things that need to be tackled in order to solve the energy issue. So it might be a good place to go check out. And for that matter, those folks are headquartered locally. So if you can get some conversations going with Breakthrough Energy, that's led by that's not the Gates Foundation, but it's led by Bill Gates and a handful of folks here in the area.
These ideas lead me to another question that is totally baked into that, but I want to talk about is getting into the nuts and bolts of it. How do you suggest Commerce could look at? I think that we can do the looks at the information that's out there, identify the gaps as they pertain to Washington based on that information, but then getting the kind of technical expertise that is required to really put out a good funding opportunity announcement around it, and then really judging that technology. Or how do we basically score and judge the applicability of whatever technology is putting forward to addressing those gaps. We've struggled internally just not having the funding. This is something that came up yesterday in the calls. Currently, we are only allowed to use 3% of the 3% of the funds for administrative purposes. That is extremely low by almost any standard. It allows us just to do the bare minimal of administration. Even up to 5% would probably just get us better administration. Bringing on true technical expertise to do some of this would cost more. As example, the CEC down in California often uses 10 to 12% fees to do some of this. Also, a big issue is technical assistance for maybe smaller communities, smaller utilities, smaller organizations that need that technical assistance help to get some of these things done. How can we look at providing that? We have reached out to in the past, and I would say with varied success, groups like the Washington State Academy of Sciences to do these things. The problem we've had there is you've got to truly integrate those folks into a team to think about it. You can't just ask them for some recommendations and then use it. You need those kind of technical experts on a team to develop the funding opportunities, to score those opportunities, and that costs money. I mean, we've gotten away for a long time now with people volunteering effectively to do these kind of things, but it's not a sustainable path forward. So do any folks have experience with or ideas on how technical expertise can be brought in to judge these kind of things? It'll be a bit helpful, I will say. One thing we need to do is narrow the funnel, as we've said, so we have a bit smaller basket of technologies. Traditionally, we've had technologies from wave energy to carbon fiber recycling to non-conductive paints to everything across the board. So I think we'll be narrowing it down a bit, but still even within that narrowed funnel, either do we require the applicant to prove they have backup that their technology is filling these gaps, has some other experts out there who point to these issues and somehow point to this technology that they're pitching as a viable way forward? Or do we figure out a way to bring more technical expertise into the commerce process? And has anybody seen examples of that?
Well, Brian, first thing comes to mind for me, it is going to cost you a little bit, and it'll cost you time as well, but is a technical advisory board, something like what Ecology's done for the Recycling Development Center. And you assemble that group. They meet 2 or 3 times a year and help craft up the criteria and judge the applications.
How many applications have you received in past rounds, Brian?
The last round, we had 62 applicants for about $6 million. I forget the total ask of those 62 applicants. Our initial funnel, to narrow it down, dropped us down to, I think, 52, and this was the problem, 52 applications that we then basically, because of the way it was written, we didn't have many internal ways to further narrow that funnel. We tried. There was a what do you call it? A challenge to that that was deemed to be credible. So we had to send all 52 applications on to a volunteer board of individuals. And it was just, I mean, one individual let us know clearly they would never be doing that again because it just wasn't realistic. So that's why I talk about some of those challenges. We've had a lot of applications and we haven't had good internal ways to narrow that funnel before it goes to those technical experts.
And so to Scott's point about it costing you a little bit, can you pay your advisory board or pay technical experts as consultants to judge the applications? Because then people are more likely to do it again, or at least not be so grouchy that they had to do a lot of work.
Yes, there's no reason we couldn't pay. It's traditionally been the funding to pay it. Tony, I mean, you've got a little experience with that. Is there any?
I was actually on the review committee because I had moved out of my position at Commerce, and so I was by far and away the least technical person on that committee, and it was absolutely overwhelming. If you had really paid folks, it would have been very expensive because those were the level of the applications were pretty comprehensive. You could have easily put in, if you really were being paid and doing due diligence, each reviewer could have easily put in 500 hours or more of time reviewing those applications. And, even at a low consulting rate, that turns out to be quite a bit of money pretty quickly. I think the critical point, and you've been talking about it, Brian, is really making sure that you have an effective, defensible funneling mechanism at the first. And if that means that you limit the nature of the applications, we're only going to do buildings and transportation, we're only going to do whatever it is, but designing a good pre-application piece, and I think supplemented by what you talked about, Scott, which is this formation of kind of a standing technical advisory committee that over time can help, define the scope of that, and then the final application is really critical, because there is no way, given this process, maybe if you're California and you're distributing, 100 million a year or something like that, you could handle 50 or 60 applications. Washington, I don't think will ever be in a position to be able to do that. So I say having as much of that beforehand, and really making sure that you run it by the legal team at the same time, so that you don't get the challenge that they got in the last round of these applications, where it was deemed that, well, in fact, no, you could not use that funnel to winnow out anyone.
So the way the Department of Energy does that is a concept paper process. So you just keep it short and sweet, and you say, hey, you're allowed 1 page or 2 page, and you got to hit these are the things that matter to us as commerce. And you say, okay, we're going to pick the 20 best concept papers. And then I think everybody's also kind of alluding to the fact that you narrow your technical scope. And so then you say, okay, we're going to accept, building level energy management papers, and the technical review committee for that technical area is this group. So then they only have to review, 10 proposals when it gets to full proposal level or something like that. And then there's a separate group that focuses on whatever, aviation fuels or something like that, and so you end up use a concept paper process to kind of narrow the overall field and chunk it into separate areas, and say, okay, each area we're gonna accept 10 full proposals, or 5 or 15 or whatever it is you decide to do. And then another Department of Energy best practice is requests for information. And so you'll see people just publish this, and this is something you could do, you'd have to do early in the process. And you say, hey, there's going to be this award process for $10 million. We're seeking advice on what are the gaps, what are the important problems that need to be solved. And you give people, they end up being your potential applicant pool. So there's some issue there, but you're identifying the players and the areas that matter in Washington State, and you get some free expertise and free advice on what people think is important in the state. So you could publish a request for information, let anybody give you feedback, and you do that, several months in advance of publishing your RFP. So you kind of use that. It's just like taking this group and broadening it out to 100 folks or something like that across different industry areas. They'll just give you your opinion because they want to influence how you do your process and where the money goes.
And I will say that some of that lack of internal funneling was our own fault. We didn't put it on the initial FFO. We tried to kind of add it in to manage the load. And that's where the challenge came in. So we do know being more upfront about the process that we're going to use will make it more feasible. We can choose how we do it. We just have to be very clear upfront in how we do it. As like any grant proposal, you can't change the rules on the fly.
Yeah, you've seen the concept paper process before, though, Brian? Yeah,
we've seen it through the DOE.
Yeah. I think that works. It works well from both ends, right? Because the whoever's reviewing all this stuff doesn't get inundated with hundreds or thousands of pages of stuff. unless it's on target. And the same from the applicant side. Nobody wants to spend a bunch of time and money on a proposal when it's not quite hitting the mark. So if you can succinctly, have an interaction that's only on a page or two to make sure that, people are close to where they need to be, then it's helpful to everybody.
The grid modernization pot of money, that's the other one. One of the other pots within Clean Energy Fund, they did start that. Bob Kirchmeier, who ran that, started implementing that, where utilities had to start with a 3-page concept paper, and they narrowed the final applicants based on those concept papers. So that is something that we've used in the past. We haven't tried to go out and do that kind of earlier, broader kind of ask of the community on where those gaps are and whatnot. I think that's probably a good idea.
I guess I'm sort of re-asking one of your primary questions, Brian, but I'm circling back to what Tony and others said about focusing on zero energy buildings or advancing local energy independence. I'm curious what folks think are the real technological barriers or lack of innovation there. And then what is really a problem with utilities not being interested in adopting these advancements? It doesn't make sense with their model, those kinds of questions. That, to me, the latter, the utility barriers, seem like the big problem. New technologies, new innovations, and some of these technologies, I don't see that as much from my perspective. So I'm curious if others see, people aren't supposed to use the word demand or the phrase demand response anymore, but is there a real need in some of those areas that is specifically technological?
Well, since I know I'm one of the ones that brought it up, Eleanor, I think what we're finding in terms of building energy performance, and I'll let others jump in if they have a different perspective on this, is that we're beginning to approach kind of an area of diminishing returns from some of the technologies. Isn't to say there isn't some interesting stuff on the horizon, but as the state is I'll use an example. The state's been advancing the energy code, and we have a statutory requirement to get to a pretty low level by 2031. Not quite, net zero, but it's, approaching that. And it's getting more and more difficult to identify, even defining it fairly broadly with carbon and other things included, to come up with that next universe of technologies that fit cost effectiveness criteria. And so I think there is a real need in that space. What are the next things that are out there? Cost-effective windows with integrated PV technology. There are several groups in Washington that have done work in that space. None of that is yet kind of commercially available or certainly cost-effective under a traditional kind of model. And I think there's a fair amount of that out there. We know that you don't need to innovate it with insulation. Lighting has gone through a pretty dramatic innovation phase, but things like heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems, again, some interesting technologies on the horizon, but there isn't that next kind of increment of the equivalent of an LED or that sort of thing. That's at least my perspective on it in the built environment.
I'm a very biased on this topic because I'm an energy storage person, have been for a long time. But that to me seems like the biggest next step. Like I was saying earlier, wind and solar are available and they're cheap and on a very massive scale. Like Tony said, there's been huge innovations in how to make buildings consume less energy. the final thing is, okay, you've got cheap renewables, but they aren't available all the time and it's not reliable. You can't use them 100%. So how do we get from using renewables 30 or 40% of the time to 100% of the time? It's storage. I don't think there's any other way. And there is a big technology gap there. You know, we've got, I think current lithium ion and lead acid battery technology is competitive up to say 4 hours of deployment, but that's not overnight, you know, and that's not, you know, days of cloudy weather or something like that. So getting the cost down to the point where solar plus storage or wind plus storage is competitive and reaches grid parity with, you know, fossil fuels and stuff like that, or hydro even would be even harder, but fossil fuels is a good starting point. That's the next big step in getting buildings and the rest of everything that we do with all this energy to zero carbon.
Again, I'm going to have to go at 11, but just following up on another question that both of those responses make me wonder, I wonder, kind of, is it useful to focus in on a particular, not just sector, but like really specific thing, like school buildings or hospitals, and use some of these funds to solve a very particular problem of energy efficiency or energy use or energy creation in a known like big energy user space? That doesn't really deal with necessarily the storage piece that you're flagging, but I know, you know, in the or it could, yeah, I don't know. I look to you to answer that. But kind of the last question about benefiting Washington, including jobs creation and other economic development activities. You know, we know that schools need to innovate. We know that there's a ton of school infrastructure that needs to be invested in. It should be invested in a way that creates good jobs and is more energy efficient and is, you know, a better learning environment. Same thing with hospitals and kind of our medical sector in general, but just thinking about big energy sucks. Can we, you know, does it make sense to like I said, focus on one very specific type of building or very specific thing and try on updating those facilities in a way that can be a model and try on new technology? And, you know, that kind of knits into the point around racial equity, because you can focus on particular communities to do that work for investment. Definitely creates jobs. You know, it just comes to mind that there's one way to think about the research and development is to actually like do the work on a particular type of problem and learn from that. I'm curious about folks' thoughts on that approach.
I like it. I think, and what it does is it sort of focuses, it's where you want to do demonstration projects. I mean, that's what I've heard already, or you want to at least have some of those. And so if you say, okay, we want schools, middle schools or high schools or something in a bunch of different regions to be a test bed where we want advanced technology installed, and you want a learning platform so kids can understand this technology and how it works in their school. I mean, I've been like, Mike, you could comment about the test beds, but like the control room that you guys have there is a cool example. PNNL has the same sort of thing. I've seen them, you know, they have a big utility type control room that shows all of the energy distribution and storage assets that they've got on their campus and how energy is moving around, and people use it to do work and study and learn. But also it's a useful asset.
Yeah.
I second that. And it, you know, not just the control room, but the test beds, we have windows everywhere, and you can look into the lab. And if you're there at the right time, watch people building, you know, printed solar arrays. So it's allowed us to host everything from, you know, MIT research groups down to middle school tours to sort of get them introduced to what our facility does and the types of technologies we're working on. So yeah, I agree.
I think of, in that respect, and this is probably one of the equity questions, there's probably the most expensive private school in Seattle, middle school or grade school, is I think one of the second or third living building challenge built in Seattle. And it's pretty amazing. You walk around there and they've got cutaways where the wall's cut out and it's plexiglass, and you see the piping systems running through the building. There's the building itself is a teaching environment, and they have whole classes based on the building, how the building operates, how the different technologies operate. It's a great example. It's also a problem that it's a grade school that costs almost $30,000 a year to send your kid to. So it wouldn't be called accessible to most folks. But there are some examples of how it's being done.
Yeah, I mean, to me, maybe it's because I'm a parent. I'm obsessing about schools right now. They're not going to be open again, but all schools need updates. Public schools, and so, you know, can we choose a particular, whether it's windows, whether it's the ventilation system, because we need better ventilation system in schools, whatever it is, and kind of apply it broadly. I don't think we would want to go to the one and only example kind of approach, because that, to your point, Brian, like that makes it super inaccessible. But if we can solve a societal problem and use these dollars to really demonstrate how it can be solved through an energy lens, that'd be awesome. And would help our kids get back to school if we choose the school's route. I appreciate you all. I have to hop off. Eleanor will stay on. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate you coming in.
So to pick up on that idea a little bit, you know, I think one of the ways that you might get to that is you could think about it as, how does this research development and demonstration program, how can you most effectively link it to other activities that are going on? So take low-income housing. So the legislature appropriated funding for net zero low-income housing a number of years ago, and came up with, and as a result of that competition, 4 pretty impressive projects. I think a couple up in Snohomish, one in Spokane, and don't remember where the 4th one was, but maybe explicitly building in a link between that program. The state has this ultra efficient, affordable housing activity that they're going to put X million dollars out. We also have a pot of money of competition, and we're urging research development demonstration folks to come up with innovative ideas to deal with ventilation in those facilities. So you do that cross linkage. It would not have to be, I think, just confined to state. I would think that maybe there'd be an opportunity to partner with the 2030 district in Seattle, an opportunity to partner with the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance and money that they're putting into market transformation. But linking it so that those organizations who are putting money out already for either research and development or much bigger demonstration projects and kind of piggyback with them on this and build those kind of partnerships.
This I think it's on this idea. This is just an example. I've been getting a lot of requests from a certain company that's designing something that's very interesting in that it pulls the carbon, the CO2 directly out of flue gases in a building environment and captures that CO2 and uses that CO2 for other applications. The problem they run into is that all our policy is focused on reducing the energy intensity, thus leading to less carbon emissions, but it doesn't incentivize capturing carbon, and they don't get credit for actually sequestering the carbon. So is that, I don't know if there's a question there, but those ideas, I think it gets also to almost carbon capture type technologies. Should we allow those kind of technologies that truly do reduce carbon or make a building say carbon zero, but aren't in line with the way our policies are trying to incentivize that? Or are we just kind of wasting our somewhat precious resources or small resources on doing that kind of work? It would probably help a company, but it might not. And it probably have effects much outside of Washington State, but it's not driving solutions towards the policy, the way our policy is built.
I think that kind of stuff is important myself. We're going to have to look at CO2 as like a circular economy kind of thing. We're going to have to recycle CO2. Like I think I said last time, all the planes and boats and trucks that are being built right now there are a whole bunch of them are still going to be on the road and in the air 20, 30 years from now and cranking out CO2. And we will be at that point, 20, 30 years from now, we will be long past a scenario where we're okay with any carbon getting, into that, into the environment, let alone those kinds of massive quantities. So you've got to do something with it. So I think those kinds of, I don't think you want to, I think you've got to distribute your technology solutions. But I think there's a place for CO2 capture, personally. And you, again, to Rebecca's point, you could say, okay, you can do this, but you can't, if you're going to use Washington money, you can't go do it in a building in New York City. You've got to do it in a school in Ellensburg or something like that.
Yeah, and to be clear, all Clean Energy Fund money has to be spent in Washington. We've had one example where we've let a capital asset go out of Washington for testing and evaluation and whatnot, mainly because it just wasn't going to happen in Washington. Although theoretically that technology could apply to Washington in the short term, there's no way to demonstrate that technology. So we did allow that, but we also expected that capital asset to eventually return to the state. So in general.
Yeah, I think that's great. The other thing that it does, Brian, is when you capture the CO2, you need to do something with it. And from in that circular CO2 economy, you make fuel with it, most likely. So you take CO2 and hydrogen and you turn it back into natural gas, diesel, jet fuel, whatever. And again, you say, okay, you point to Boeing or PACCAR or the power utilities to use that CO2 in some sort of an effective way. And there's lots of technical challenges and issues associated with that as well, but that's the transformative You know, it's early stage work. It's a ways off, but those are the kinds of things that probably need to be in the pipeline in order for us to eventually hit our goals.
All right. Here's a time check here. 1 o'clock. 1:10. So let's go on to the second question. I think we've, well, we haven't addressed it because I'll talk about it a little bit. Should the scope of eligible participants be limited or expanded? Another question inherent there is, should we be looking at 3 or 4 big multi-stakeholder, multi-million-dollar projects, or should we be looking at 10 to 20, $100,000 awards, whatever your numbers might be? But yeah, so again, a couple big projects or spreading that over lots of different projects. I also think that then brings you back to the level of tech review that is possible or needed. If you're going for a couple big ones, you probably can delve deeper into the technical feasibility and whatnot of those bigger ideas. Whereas if you're trying to spread that peanut butter over a lot of smaller projects, you may have a higher chance of getting some big wins out of it, but it's going to be hard to delve down into the technical merit as much in each project.
So I like the idea of having a sort of a hybrid system where you try to do both. You know, assuming the funding is there, you could have sort of the R&D pot and then the D pot, right? Where you have a couple of big ticket items that are sort of later stage and looking to be or ready to be deployed, and then you have another portion of the money that is designed to support the early stage innovation, which, you know, I think last time we talked about, you know, the real progress comes from, you know, the folks with startup companies or out of university. That's where like the real innovation is coming from. And I don't think we want to leave them behind, but I also agree that you know, we want to support stuff that can make an impact soon. And thinking about this quite a bit, you know, I don't know that we want to further limit the scope of eligible participants, but we may want to just add structure to the money and maybe subdivide it somewhat.
I like that idea, Mike. One thought for you, kind of building on that, is could you solicit demonstration projects, but ask that they be very you know, relatively diverse in their technology solutions. So you just say, hey, we want to take, you know, renewable energy. We want to take storage technologies. We want to take chemical conversion technologies, and, you know, energy management, sophisticated building designs, all of that kind of stuff are the kinds of things that we want to have in these demonstration projects. And those projects use existing technology to make it work. But then you say, okay, we also want you to be, if you're one of these demonstration projects, we want you to be a test bed for future technologies. And you say to the graduate students and the startup companies and the people with the, you know, the entrepreneurs with a brand new idea, you fund them to get their work to some sort of implementable level, so that they could say, okay, hey, I just came up with the solar concentrator I won this CEF fund, so I'm eligible to demonstrate it at one of the test sites, at an elementary school, at a hospital, at a utility plant, wherever those demonstration projects end up being. I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think of that.
I'll pile on. I like that kind of approach, the two-part, because I think sort of mechanically, the first part if you focus on the R&D side and those emerging companies, it's the potential is that smaller amounts of money might fit. A company has matching funds and they need another 50K or they need another 100K to bring in that matching fund to move forward. Demonstration projects, if you really want to have some value there, you're probably talking $1 million plus. And I think one of the other advantages that comes to mind with the demonstration projects is that's where you can be much more explicit in building in jobs, social equity, and those kinds of dimensions, and say, this is what we want. We want to create these test beds. We want to try out these new technologies. We want to do a demonstration. And can we do that in a public housing facility? Can we do that in an area that would be a growth management planned community where you reduce transportation besides whatever else you're doing? I think that can be a way to do it. Now, if you do the two parts, I think the only thing to be aware of, well, one of the things to be aware of is that that also means it may be a little more complicated and may require more administrative time and effort on Commerce's part than just picking one or the other in terms of size.
So then, Tony, since you brought up matching, I think one of the reasons that smaller dollar amounts might work for early stage R&D is a lot of times if they have federal funding, right, and this is a matching program, if they have federal funding, early stage R&D grants from DOE and other organizations, it's typically 20% match, right? So the state dollars go farther, right? You're getting 4x or 5x for the amount of money that we're putting into it from the state. But when you get to demo scale or manufacturing scale, it's more like 50-50, which is another reason to have more money going towards the later stage stuff. But
yeah, I agree. And I think, one of the other things you can often get there, Mike, too, is you can get the advantage that if they've already got the federal funding, there's already been some due diligence. You know that they've gone through some kind of a review, and potentially it could make it easier on the state's part to say, that's a minimum hurdle for you. And we know we don't have to go back to first principles and evaluate, whether you're violating the laws of thermodynamics in your project. We'll sort of assume that, the feds took care of that for us, and they don't have to do as much.
Yeah, the trick there is that a lot of times when you apply for federal money, you have to show that you have the match ready to go, which actually kind of puts the state first. Yeah, especially the way the CF is currently written, right? You apply and you have about a year, right, to find the funding. So.
Yeah, well, we have done contingent before. We've said. And I know we've provided that over the years to some of these R&D projects where, they'll go for the federal money, and we have provided them, or Commerce did, I can't use the we anymore. Commerce provided them with a letter that said, we're applying, and if this is selected, these funds would be available for match. And I know some companies that actually worked for them to have that contingent letter. I don't know if Brian used to want to, go in that direction or not, but.
No, I think it has been successful. I mean, the federal agencies seem to accept it. They understand it's a program, a competitive program. So yeah, and then I always try to point us back whenever we think about this to what the law requires us to do, what's written in the budget versus kind of what Commerce and administratively we put around it. And we've put some barriers around it that have made that a little more difficult, but there's nothing that says we have to. So we've been successful in the past doing it, and we've got some flexibility in how we design it and the requirements to allow that to be easier to do. It is, I mean, we also have found, as we all know, it is hard to line up. This pot of money, our pot of money, happens every 2 years. You really want to get it out, and so you don't lose it within those 2 years. And that's what happened with the first pot of money, really, is the feds, as they often do, delayed their decision by more than 6 months. And it really threw us into a bit of a conundrum. So lining, and this also goes, there's talk of lining it in the past, of lining this bucket of money up with projects in different CEF buckets of money, like the grid mod bucket. Theoretically doable, you just get timing, and those, it can be hard to connect them often. But there's nothing that says we can't do it.
One other thought I had is just, we talked about wanting to build collaborative networks. And so one thing you could just say, hey, we want to, the money that we would supply for these small seed projects, we want you to, you should be a research program associated with one of the major universities. We want to fund a graduate student or an undergrad. We want to provide a scholarship, maybe, I don't know, to, somebody at UW, WSU, Western, a postdoc at PNNL, those kinds of things. And then I think that will, that either it's a company that's already being kind of kindled within those organizations, and that's great, or it's a startup company that is getting access to some of those university resources and labs, and that's good. And then it also a little bit solves some of the credibility issues, because you won't have some wacko entrepreneur that is, like Tony said, talking about something that defies the laws of gravity or thermodynamics or something like that. If you've got a reputable university professor or national lab researcher looped in, you're in a slightly better spot technology wise.
Yep, I can guarantee you almost every round we will get somebody who has a black box that takes gravity waves and turns them into energy.
Right.
I'm not kidding. I see it a lot.
Yeah. And for that matter, you also, I'm routinely impressed with what gets done on a graduate stipend, or something like that for $20,000 or $50,000 at a university for a year with some specific goals. Universities are better at kind of really early stage research, but if you say, hey, the objective here is to make a device and actually be able to test it in a relevant environment, and here's $100K. Yeah, they're not all going to get there, but I think that some of them probably would. I don't know. Mike, would you care to comment on that? Do you have some? You've seen that probably more times than I have, or not?
Yeah, I think certainly it's student dependent, but you get the right person working on the right project, they can make pennies go a really long way pretty quickly too. There's one of the things that this is tangential, so I won't talk about it too much, but College of Engineering has, and certain departments have sort of advanced master's program, and they're all PhD caliber candidates that don't want to stay the full 5 or 6 years, and they know that they have to graduate, and they can get stuff done really fast. And like I said, they're usually the upper echelon of master's students from what I've been able to see in our lab.
Yeah, and a lot of those folks have industry connections. Most of them are, or a lot of them anyway, are working still, or come from industry. That's all, and that's also job creation, right? Even if it's part-time, but if you say, hey, we're gonna pay a graduate student, it's one job for 1 year, guaranteed, right?
And from what I've seen, those people are very highly sought after when they do graduate. I haven't really seen anybody in that master's program struggle to get a job afterwards.
Okay.
And I think you see that in pockets at all the universities too. Even I think Western does a fantastic job of getting, even just undergrads trained in research and working on projects that are pretty impressive and well aligned with industry. And WSU certainly does the same. And you see some pretty innovative postdocs at the lab. Those folks are a little bit more expensive, but still a lot less than hiring, me as a PhD with, 15 or 20 years of experience is pretty expensive, right? So you get less jobs and less, I don't know, it's just, the money goes a little further probably.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for everybody to think about too. If you look at the makeup of this board by the legislature of the executive board, it's our research institutions, UW and WSU, but it's also all of our four-year state colleges. Scott's on here. And that is a focus that we're trying to figure out, is how we can make sure that those ones that don't have the advanced research capabilities or are forming them but don't have them as fully formed as our big three, how can those students still be involved, be connected to these kind of opportunities, or maybe focus on the companies that are spinning out of those kind of institutions as well. Another thing, I think Mike, brought it up, but how much leverage you're able to get by maybe the smaller companies, and maybe this isn't fair, but we have to, traditionally, we've always had to, they have to provide at least a 50-50 match. There's nothing that says we couldn't require higher match. Is that, and I think for the demo projects, that's probably harder, although maybe not if you've got some really big players involved, especially on the corporate side. But is that unfair to small companies that ratchet up their required leverage? Or do you think that's just going to make it something that's already really hard for them that much harder?
Again, I'd look to the Department of Energy. Sometimes will change their criteria, so they'll put a 20% match in for small companies and a 50% for large companies. And there's some threshold, 500 employees or 100 employees or something like that. Is where you draw the line.
Okay, yeah, and that was brought up, I think, actually by Angela yesterday in our bigger meeting, is exactly that. The feds will have kind of a sliding scale sometimes. We can't go below 50-50, but we could require higher.
Yeah, the sliding scale usually is correlated with TRL level for the research.
I haven't seen too many programs that require more than a 50% match, though. I could see that looking daunting to people who are trying to apply.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think when you get to things like hubs and larger competitions that like came out of the Recovery Act, the larger the match, the more competitive you were seeing in terms of industry. So all the different teams for different opportunities were absolutely scrambling to bring as much money, non-federal money, to the table as possible. You know, and the thing I think we should also, as I mentioned yesterday, Brian, consider is that depending on the sector, a number of our private sector potential partners at this time may suffer some liquidity challenges, particularly within the utility space right now, as like collection of consumers aren't able to pay their bills, you know, and so the cost share requirement for industry participation is also, you know, maybe it's another factor to consider in all of this, and as changes and or modifications to CEF are considered.
Yeah.
Brian, is the match actually hardwired in? It was not originally hardwired in the language. We did that. We instituted that as a policy, and it was not hardwired into the legislative language. Is there a match requirement actually in the legislative language now?
Well, I would have easily said, yes, there is, but now you've made me question that. I'm pretty sure it's written in that a minimum of 50, the state won't fund more than 50% of any project.
Okay, I know it was not in the originals, but it may have come later on. So just one of those possible, you know, outside of the box. And in particular, if you're looking for projects that promote equity or other kinds of things, you might want to consider a lower match in order to bring in a project that might not otherwise make it, if you have that flexibility.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this might be one of those unintended consequences, but maybe it wasn't written in the first one. We required it for our own purposes, and then the legislature saw that and codified it. So that is something to keep in mind that can happen, but I will double check that.
And it's good to note if could it be an in-kind match, because that's a big difference, right? If somebody's...
Yes, we do allow, I think, 100% in kind. I don't think there is sometimes we could score maybe some amount of cash higher, but we do allow 100% in kind match.
So Brian, in terms of timing, it's 11:30 now. So if you wanted to move on to the third question, spend about 20 minutes on that one, and then allow 10 minutes for a wrap up.
All right, thank you, Alana.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's talk a little bit. How can outcomes related to benefiting Washington, including job creation, other economic development activities? So I guess I have a problem with this sometimes in an R&D thing, because you're not doing R&D, you're not creating innovation to create jobs. And sometimes, yes, like getting a grad student in, it is a job. A demonstration project is going to be able to show more jobs through the construction aspects. But even with this level of money, sometimes those jobs, the amount of jobs created doesn't necessarily scratch the itch of politicians and whatnot that want to see bigger job numbers, bigger economic benefit. So do we bias towards, again, those more demonstration projects that at least show better than what an R&D project? The other thing we can do is, like the R&D projects, you can have a company explain how, if it goes, it could lead to huge benefits, and if we go, we're going to hire 500 people and all this stuff. I think those arguments are a bit, I mean, they're probably true. That's what those companies want to do, but the reality is you're probably going to see pretty optimistic views of what could theoretically happen that you're probably not going to actually see unless you make the 100% right bet. So I guess other ways that we could think about how we ask for them to explain how it would benefit Washington. If it's jobs and direct economic development, great, but are there other ways we can judge companies on their benefit to Washington? And as I ask this question, I think we've already talked about it a lot, in lining with policy and showing how you can meet policy goals and whatnot. So I've got another thought that we could think about, but I'll open it up to this and see if anybody has any ideas.
Have we ever been explicit, and I don't recall that we have, in terms of maybe taking a focus on WMBE, women and minority-owned businesses, or those kinds of criteria? And again, I don't know, given the nature of what state law is, what ability we have in that space, but that might be one aspect to think about rather than simply just numbers of jobs.
Yeah, I would say with the early stage R&D, but first of all, I agree. Working in the sort of women minority-owned businesses and other what's the right word? I'm gonna mind block here, but disadvantaged or underrepresented communities, rural sometimes fits into that too. But in terms of the R&D side, I think the benefit to Washington is a little bit different than just hard job numbers, right? I mean, it's we talk about it at the test beds, is building an ecosystem and like creating a community where startups can survive and thrive, and building the state's profile in that regard. If it's funding somebody at a university, it's still jobs. It's just a different part of the talent pipeline, right? You're training students and potentially students from community colleges all the way up through PhDs and postdocs to be able to perform in a advanced clean energy sector in the state. And we've, in the test beds, I think, over the course of the 3 years have been around, I've written 3 different proposals that have included, Green River, or Bellevue, or North Seattle shoreline, and getting students who are, looking for manufacturing certificates or associate's degrees, like into the lab and learning about advanced manufacturing. So I think that's, there is a story to be told there, and I don't think it's unreasonable to ask applicants to address that.
One thing we've done within JC Dream projects is ask people to show us what this leads to generally, and it doesn't have to necessarily be jobs or some story about how they're going to reduce carbon emissions, but it could just be, it could be follow-on investment. It could be future grant opportunities. It could be educational output, students engaged, improvement in hitting diversity targets and reaching minority and other disadvantaged populations. So where does it lead? What does the project lead to, and what is it going to grow into, and that's bigger than just what it is right now?
Sorry. All right. I had something else here I wanted to talk about. Keep talking, talk amongst yourselves too if you have some things. Let's see what I wrote down in the beginning here.
Yeah, I'll jump in then. I think it makes a lot of sense that it's hard to use job creation, other metrics to evaluate outcomes for research and innovation and demonstration. But I think sort of what Aaron's saying, if the applicant can identify how this research, this investment could lead to more equitable outcomes, I think that's important for them to be able to, identify without being really vague and trying to just answer the question. But certainly in the built environment, there are a lot of ways that technology will, could be used to make things more equitable. It doesn't have to just be that it would be cheaper once it's mass produced or something, but it's serving a specific need that's not being met, perhaps, would be a way to define benefiting Washington here.
Okay. And actually, the question I was thinking about earlier, we did address is that idea of how do we bring on that technical expertise and using outside groups and whatnot. So I think we did kind of get to that. Okay. Got about 20 minutes. I've already got a lot of notes. I will open it up a bit too. Are there other things that we are missing here or that we should address in the time we have left? I just realized I've got a bunch of chat messages. All right. But, all right, I think we're good. So yeah, I'll just open up the floor with the time we have. With about 5 minutes left, I got one more question for y'all. But is there anything in general that we're missing, things we should be talking about that we're not? Anything you want the executive board to hear in the next roundup or areas they should focus on?
Has anyone ever considered, maybe you have, and it's just an administrative nightmare, but doing rolling applications or quarterly applications rather than annual, just to try to give people a little more flexibility with matching with federal grant calls? Judging by your reaction, it is administratively not easy.
Well, it has been suggested, we're actually looking at something like that. We have a program called SRF, the Strategic Reserve Fund in my division of commerce, that it is considered a competitive award, and it is based on a rolling application. I think just because of, especially this pot of money, we've had our challenges in administering it, and those suggestions are usually met with great concern from the administrators, because it would make it in their mind that much more complicated. That being said, there is nothing saying that we can't do that or maybe shouldn't do that. Because yeah, it is, I mean, I'm dealing with it right now. You just get this backlog. Hey, we're having trouble. If we don't get an FFO out, you just get this backlog of people waiting with bated breath, wondering when it's going to come out, wanting to get some sort of application in. And then we set some date, and then everybody's got to pile on that date. So I think it's feasible to do that rolling application. It might just be overcoming some internal concerns, but I think it's a good thing to bring up. And that, I mean, that also brings up, I kind of mentioned, we have traditionally said technical expertise, these have to be technically reviewed by an external board of technical experts. Traditionally, that has been us using our networks to find folks who've retired out of academia or maybe still in it and are just interested in volunteering for this. But there's nothing that says we have to judge these on technical merit. There's nothing that says we have to have this external technical expertise. I mean, we could keep this 100% in commerce. I'm not saying we probably would. We want some of that external. But this idea that the only way to give out this money is by strict technical review of independent, we've even looked outside the state for some of these folks to avoid conflict of interest. There's nothing that says we have to do that. We could base 100% of the applications on benefit to Washington and have very little technical review or requirement, or make them explain what they can point to show that technically it's feasible or of interest. and we just base it on them being able to explain it well, and then us internally deciding that this is for the benefit of what this is most beneficial to the state of Washington. I guess one thing, you guys are always replying to different agencies, federal agencies I'm talking about. We could also talk about maybe institutions, other institutions that provide this kind of funding. Are there any most of it we look to the DOE. Obviously the DOE is thinking about these same questions, but just curious, does anybody work with another federal agency that has a really great program, even if it's not innovation focused maybe, but just a program that people agree really works well, gets the money out efficiently, shows good results, and is also easy for applicants to apply for? Somewhat, I think some part of this equity issue is making these applications easy enough that a small company that can barely keep its head above water anyways has the time and the resources to actually put forward an effective proposal that will be considered. So if there's any other examples out there that you'll know of, that would be good to know.
You've looked at ARPA-E, I presume, right?
Yeah, yes. I mean, this is another thing, looked at versus truly delving into how they run their programs is probably.
Yeah, I mean, they're the first ones that did the whole concept paper thing. They also do a focused solicitation. So they say, hey, for this one, we're interested in, you know, I don't know, lithium-ion batteries. And this one, we're interested in biogas. In this one, we're interested in building efficiency, or, you know, low E glass or whatever, you know, I don't know. They hit all kinds of different topic areas with focused solicitations and calls. And you guys could stretch this out a little if you wanted to. You could break it up into a few different chunks that were to different technology focus areas like that. It's a little hard because it starts to get into too many small pieces. And it's when it's already a small pie, but.
Yeah. You know, another thing, and I don't think y'all probably have to deal with this as much, but the other thing that companies I think that have won some clean energy fund money in the past will say, there's one thing about getting the money out. The other thing is how we run those contracts on the back end and how difficult those contracts might be for companies to just get the contracts in place in the first place. And then kind of how we project manage, what we expect of those companies moving forward and whatnot. But I guess and you can not say it all now, but I think if there's other examples of how the contracting on the back end of the process is made easier for companies, that would also be interesting.
And they set project objectives, and they're pretty clear about requiring you to, this is Department of Energy again, you know, set some project goals that are laid out in the proposal so that people are kind of bought into that from the beginning. And then during the contracting phase, the feds do the best they can to make sure that the contract comes out with goals that are very similar, you know, or preferably the same as what was promised in the proposal. And letting applicants know that, you know, you can't just go throw out something that you think could work. We're going to hold you to it. And then doing it in phases, doing you know, having go, no-go decisions. So you have a 1 year or a half year period of performance, and you got to hit certain targets. And if you don't, there's an opportunity for the state to say, whoa, okay, hold on, maybe this was a bad decision. This one's not working out. You know, those are things that are common practices. I don't think very often they pull the money, or it'd have to be a bad, it looks bad on both parties. It looks bad on the state and the applicant if it ends up as a fail, so you want to have it work out, but it just sort of puts a little teeth into it.
Yep. All right, and I'm glad I still got Eleanor, because last kind of question about this process. So we've had 2 meetings. Most of the other subcommittees are also in this trying to decide between 2 and having a 3rd meeting. The 3rd meeting, as I proposed it, was to address within this specifically ideas around how to better incorporate equity and justice into our program. Do you all think that is most effective here in this subcommittee? Or the other idea is that we would have a whole executive committee meeting specific to that topic, and we can do both as well. So if anybody has any opinions on the need for a third with that specific lens, or is that lens better for the larger executive committee? And then, or a third, or some other topic that we need to address or should be addressing in this that would require a 3rd meeting. And Eleanor, I'd really like to hear your ideas on that, as maybe where how that lens would most, do we flow it up from this group, or do we really just do a focused idea for the executive board group? Because quite frankly, the recommendations are going to come from that executive board. It'll be acknowledged that there are subcommittees that float information up to them, but at the end of the day, that which the legislature will see will be those recommendations from the executive board. So I guess where's our time best spent?
Thanks for raising that question, Brian. My initial response is that I think it would be useful for us to talk about that within our D&D, because as we sort of already explored, it's a very different question, right? We are trying to promote innovation. And so how do you make innovation equitable is a very different question than how you modernize the grid to make it more equitable, I think. For example, and I think, we've talked about some technologies here that are way out, that really would require, that we think we need for our system. The state energy strategy might identify it as an area of focus, but the things that, air capture of carbon, those kinds of things, that's not going to meet anybody's needs directly. And so I think there is an equity. There's ways to look at innovation and demonstration and question if we're looking at something that's over the very long term, is that an outcome that's really going to benefit Washingtonians anytime soon? So those are just some thoughts around how innovation and demonstration, it seems like a unique topic to me that we could spend a 3rd meeting on, rather than rolling it up.
Yeah, and I agree in the sense it is I'm interested in that subject because it is very perplexing or difficult conversation on how you think of R&D through an equity lens. So I may also be reaching out to folks on how we could shape that discussion, or who we could bring in to shape that discussion with a specific R&D lens. We do have some work within commerce that we are doing. I know Michael Barish, who's been working on that for commerce with a lot of our partners, provided an overview to the grid modernization group on the work that commerce is doing. So that could be one thing, is a little overview of what commerce is already doing in respects to CETA and electrification transportation with that equity lens. That might be informative to folks. But then, like, I know Dan Schwartz at Clean Energy Institute is building up a program to address these. So I may be reaching out, or folks have ideas on people who can address that very specific idea of how you look at R&D funding with an equity lens, because it is very different, and at least for me, it's a pretty complex idea.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot, Brian, and how we do that within JC Dream, because we also, I'm always thankful that we have a bit of an educational mandate as well to educate the public on the technology issues and critical materials and energy related challenges that we're working on. And so I've been thinking about how do we, and of course the current situation has really driven that home and highlighted how important that is to me. And that's, I think what I recognize is, okay, the engineering and technology sector is severely broken in terms of the representation of minorities and women. And I've recognized that since I was an undergrad, right? You know, just sitting in a class where there's, you know, one black kid and one woman in my class of 50 engineers, you know, you can tell right from the get-go. And it's gotten better. By the time I was in grad school, you know, I'm noticing a bit of an improvement. And when I go back to visit UW or WSU, it's a little bit better, but it's still a way off. You know, I think engineering and engineering is like is 20% women, I think, or 25% women. And I don't know what the minority representation is, but it's also equally bad. And so what I have arrived at is that we're losing these groups early in their educational experience. And so it's probably around middle school or something like that, where for some reason we start to lose certain girls and certain minorities, and they never come back. And you don't, and so it's basics, it's math and science and that kind of stuff that eventually leads to, you know, physics and you know, biochemistry and material science engineering and all of that. And so I'm not sure what you do with something like the Clean Energy Fund, but perhaps you say, you know, you look to the groups that currently are, you know, white male dominant or Asian male dominant or whatever, and you say, okay, you guys you have to engage the middle school and high school and undergrad community to work on fixing that. So you have to, and that's kind of why I liked Rebecca's idea of using schools as demonstration projects, because you go to the Black community and you say, hey, we're going to do this technology demonstration in your neighborhood, and this is how this is why it's important. Let me teach you about the technology. I don't know. Those are some of the kinds of things that I think matter and help people stick with the STEM education, you know, but you got to maintain it. You got to get them really interested in elementary school and middle school, and you got to not lose them when math gets hard in high school, and, you know, show them the path to a career. But it's a big deal. It's really important. I was having a conversation with Paul Petrie, who's the chancellor at WSU Everett, where my office is located. And I was just pointing out to him that these technology degrees are, they're gateways to leadership. So, you know, you look at Fortune 500 companies, and a huge number of those CEOs are engineers or scientists. They're all, I think, like more than half of them are either business or engineering undergraduate majors. And then those, so when that set of leaders ends up being a bunch of people that, you know, look like me, then that ends up being part of the problem. Instead of being able to have those CEOs that are at the top being women and minorities, you just end up with a different result. And that ends up being a part of the problem. So anyway, sorry, I kind of went on for a while there, but I think that somehow helping kids at an early stage understand this technology and engaging them in it is really, really important. And I think that you have an opportunity to force those not force, but really strongly encourage the innovators that are currently doing this stuff to do some hand-holding in the women and minority communities in some way to improve the outcome on education.
All right, that's helpful. So real quick, I've got a minute left. You guys, if you have something really, we can keep talking. But what I took away from that is, yes, it's probably a third meeting, a constructive meeting based on those, on equity and justice lens. But also, I think this in general has really, more than I expected, brought back how we need to bring the education component, and not just at the graduate or PhD level, but make sure these projects have an educational component that reaches almost all the way down. So all the way down through the different ranks of education. So I think maybe a third meeting based on, with those two lenses, equity and justice, how you think about it in this arena, and maybe fleshing out a little bit more ideas on how we can require these projects, or some part of these projects, to really include a educational component in it to kind of increase the tail of their effectiveness. So if anybody has a problem with that, let me know. But that's what I will look at arranging. I would expect that would be, well, before August 13th. I know for myself it would have to be that, but I will try to get that on the board here fairly quickly. There will also, just so you know, we are kind of moving into a phase where there will be some public comment periods on this. I don't know exactly how we're going to do it. I don't think it's going to be public presentations as much. There is a website that's up which will have this information, and I know we'll have forums where people can provide input. But you'll be kept in the loop on what that looks like as we develop how that is done. So with that, let everybody go to lunch, unless there's anything else to talk about.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Thank you all for your input and time on this. I appreciate it.
All right.
And I've got a lot of you on multiple panels, so thanks for the time.